These are the faces of Kamala Harris's supporters at a watch party in Washington, D.C. right now, as a Democratic win looks less and less likely. The Harris campaign reportedly turned off projections for the rest of election night, while some began leaving the event early.
Well, I want to thank you all very much. This is great. These are our friends. We have thousands of friends on this incredible movement. This was a movement like nobody's ever seen before.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into what I believe is the single most crucial conversation we can have right now post-election. I was going to make this video regardless of who won the election because I think that this discussion is so important and foundational. You see, we need to understand the foundation of our society and the potential consequences if we don't confront it. In this clip, Dr. Patrick Deneen from Notre Dame joins Bishop Robert Barron in an eye-opening dialogue on the profound distinction between modern and classical views of liberty. The premise is simple but alarming. The current structure of liberalism, the very framework of our society, is on shaky grounds. In the words of Dr. Patrick Deneen, it has failed. You see, we have this modern conception of freedom, and it might actually be sowing seeds of societal upheaval and breakdown rather than flourishing. So this is a thought-provoking, prophetic, and frankly essential conversation for us to hear right now. So sit back and let's dive into this critical conversation. Check this out.
This today.
Thank you, Bishop. Thanks for having me. Since it's the start of baseball season, I just want to say how humbled I am to be here, and it feels to me like I've been called up from the minors, and now,
you're now in the majors.
Now in the majors, being here across the table from you.
Well, I do appreciate that. We'll see if we can play at a high level today. Well, listen, there's so much to talk about, and the books, as I say, are very thought-provoking and important books for the conversation. I thought maybe one way to get into it is to explore this kind of paradox that you observe, that liberalism is failing or has failed not because of opponents external to it, but because it's been true to its own principles, that there's something self-destructive about liberalism. Maybe we start with that. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, these are themes that are not, I know, not unfamiliar to you. You speak about these a lot. But the basic presupposition of liberalism, as I understand it, and I think as the tradition of political philosophy and theology would understand this, is that liberalism is ideally about the completely and truly free human being, the person, and freedom in the modern sense, freedom from any kind of obstacle or that which prevents us from achieving what it is we wish, what our will would desire. Of course, this is in contrast to the classical and the Christian understanding of liberty, as you know well. And that I would say, for much of American history, certainly for much of course, Western history, even if that modern view wasn't predominant, there was a kind of practice that came alongside its more ancient understanding. And those practices were basically practices we would think of as the sort of practices of virtue. In other words, the capacity to be self-limiting and learning to be self-limiting, which is, of course, very deeply in the Aristotelian tradition, very deeply in the Christian tradition. But when your definition of liberty becomes the freedom from or the freedom to do as one wishes, then those older practices and even institutions that taught us a kind of self-limitation, those now have to be either eliminated or changed, redefined, right? So that it's not that all the institutions go away. It's not that our Constitution goes away. It's not that institutions of politics or society go away. Like, for example, the schools don't go away, but their purpose changes, right? What it is they're engaged in doing. And the more we realize this modern notion of freedom in practice, the more, in a sense, we are left with the kind of realization, kind of the practical, political, social, economic realization of those commitments. And I think when we look at the large number of pathologies of the modern world, I think you can really trace them back to the realization of this theory of liberty. So this is all just to say that liberalism has failed because it succeeded. In other words, it took a long time. But when we think about the decay or the even destruction of all of the various institutions that you would think are necessary to a flourishing life, starting with the family all the way up to a political order, I think you can see the consequences of...
They're all in crisis in different ways, aren't they?
They all are. And I think there's a way in which many people who view these crises, it's a little bit like the blind men looking at the elephant.
right.
You tend to see it in sort of not connecting the dots. And I think if there was anything about my book that many people tell me, this first book, Why Liberalism Failed, many people tell me resonated with them, is it helped them to sort of connect the dots.
These are all kind of a function of a same set of assumptions
Yeah.
that have produced this. We were talking before we started about Robert Sokolowski, who was one of my teachers at Catholic U many years ago. And I took his seminar in political philosophy, and I was just a kid at the time, but it was such an eye-opener because coming of age as an American, you take certain things for granted about politics and the purpose of government and all that. And then to read from the classical authors that the purpose of government really is to make us good, and it has something to do with virtue, and that freedom is not, as you're saying, simply doing what I want so I don't harm other people. There's one limit to it. But doing what I want, as opposed to, no, it's actually a kind of disciplining of your desire to make the achievement of virtue possible. But that was like a revolution in my own mind. Like, what do you mean that's the purpose of government? But for much of Western history, that was taken for granted until this shift occurred in early modernity.
So I think one of the things that's always, I hesitate to say this, but it's always a bit of a revelation to my students at Notre Dame. And this, you're talking about CUA, I assume, right? So even Catholic students, right, who grow up maybe going to Catholic schools, and going to church every week, perhaps, if not more often, even they have imbibed the dominant understanding of liberty. Even they, I'll often ask them, how do you understand, or how would you define liberty, or how would you define freedom? And they'll give me the almost Lockean definition of liberty, because it's the predominant view of the world that they imbibe more deeply than even maybe what they get in their formal education. Yeah. And then we do a dive in my classes from teaching Intro to Political Theory. We do a dive into thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. And I really emphasize, among other things, that take Plato as an example, in the Republic, when he gets to the description and discussion of what is the nature of the tyrant and what's the nature of tyranny, the tyrant appears to be the freest person in the world, because the tyrant can do whatever he or she wants. The tyrant is defined, in a sense, by the modern understanding of liberty. They can do as they wish. And then, in the course of describing what the tyrant is, he constantly, Plato, through Socrates, keeps describing him as a slave. Yeah. That the tyrant has the soul of a slave, because there is never a point in which the tyrant, in a sense, can ever fulfill the infinite desires that the human beings possess. And so the tyrant, in fact, is the least free human being.
And it's the problem that we've all become our own little tyrants. That there's not one tyrant. We're all a tyrant. Because, hey, look, it's my will. It's my desire. And as long as I don't harm you, but I've got the freedom to do whatever I want.
That's right.
And then you've got a society of little tyrants who have no sense of cohesion or of a real common good.
Well, of course, this is the understanding that lies at the heart of liberalism, which is, the title of the book is Why Liberalism Failed. And at base, I think the liberal sort of anthropology, right, the theory of human nature, is actually that we're all fundamentally tyrants. And
Hobbes.
And it's Hobbes. Right? This is Thomas Hobbes' understanding of human beings in the state of nature are tyrants. And the only way to restrain people from acting as tyrants is to impose from the top down this sort of external force, because it will not be internally gained. We can't develop the self-mastery. We don't have that capacity, right? In our heart of hearts, even if you and I might appear to be well-mannered, well-disciplined people, but in fact, put us, sort of Lord of the Flies, put us on the desert island,
we'll quickly
and our
devolve
tyranny
into
will,
the war of all against
selves
all.
will manifest itself. So the only thing that keeps us from being little tyrants, the little Platonic tyrants, is this kind of imposition of the state that we all recognize we have to have. It's a kind of mutual non-aggression pact. But notice what this means is that what claims to be a philosophy of freedom is actually a philosophy in which ultimately, to keep us from acting freely, we have to have this kind of state that presumes there's no capacity to develop us as sort of virtuous human beings. We have to prevent the tyrant from sort of bursting forth. And so people are sometimes shocked and they sort of disappointed that, well, liberalism in theory is a philosophy of freedom, but we have such a big and oppressive government. Why is it that liberalism has developed this massive bureaucratic state? Well, it's built into it.
Yeah. It's protective, not directive, right? So classical political philosophy kind of directing people toward a moral end, where our sense is more, it's protective. So I've got rights, you've got rights, but we got to be protected from each other because we're a threat to each other.
Yeah, that's right.
Say a little bit, let's say with Hobbes, because I remember taking a seminar with Sokolowski and Thomas Hobbes, and something so fundamental shifted in Hobbes. And the wars of religion are often cited as a reason for that. But when Hobbes kind of blithely says in the Leviathan that, well, the old philosophers talked about the good, the summum bonum and all this, but there's none of that anymore. The good is just what I happen to desire, what you happen to desire. I mean, what happened? What happened to get from Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Hobbes? Wars of religion, I get it, that we just couldn't adjudicate our disputes. But put some more meat on those bones for me, because I wrestle with that. How do we get to Thomas Hobbes?
Well, of course, the kind of the Whiggish theory, right? The theory that the winners of those debates tell is that in order to resolve the wars on religion, we had to have some way of reaching resolution in which we would just basically, to use the philosophical term of art, we would bracket religious questions, or we would bracket questions of the good. Those would no longer be relevant.
And the
right.
good,
So there would be no more finis ultimus or summum bonum because we can't agree. We can't agree on what that is. And therefore, those questions will be put aside, and we'll simply create a society in which we can have peace, and peace will be maintained by the sovereign, and people can pursue whatever they value, whatever they believe as a private matter. So it's a kind of privatization of the good, right? It's the idea that whatever you think is the good, whatever I think is the good, that's privatized.
Right.
And in the public domain, it's just a kind of matter of peacekeeping.
Is that when Courtney Murray talks about the constitutional arrangement in our country as articles of peace?
Yeah.
So in a way, bracketing questions of ultimate good, although he certainly will invoke the natural law. Yeah. But at the same time, that stress is very Hobbesian, isn't it? They're articles of peace so we can kind of get along with each other.
Right. So the theory, at least, suggests that absent any agreement upon the good, you can have a society in which there's lots of kind of, you could say, this is in some ways the theory of pluralism, right? There's lots of little pockets in which people can pursue their idea of the good, and this would be religious pluralism. But Hobbes, I think, understands that what will come to predominate is a kind of what we would today call value relativism. And in fact, the language of values really comes from Hobbes. Hobbes, maybe Luther, there's maybe not as much distance between Luther and Hobbes as one might suspect.
Well, the anthropology is something in common.
It is. It is. It's fundamentally individualistic.
Right.
But the language of values is that there are only values. There's no truth.
Right. Yeah.
And Hobbes really stresses this. In fact, there's a chapter in which he talks about values, which in his view includes how we value human life. Right. Human life has no inherent dignity. It's simply what the market
will bear.
Will sort of how it will evaluate your life.
Yeah.
And if we think about our world today, well, what is our world? If your life is considered valuable, you get to live. And if you're no longer valuable, you either won't be born, or if you notice what's happening, of course, as you do, increasingly arguments that we should begin to evaluate the sort of usefulness of human life, particularly at the end of life. If you're no longer valuable to our society, then you should probably shuffle off the stage.
And who's making that judgment but the state?
Well, I mean, the state, but also the state reinforced by a value-free society. So Hobbes really, it seems to me, reveals the way in which even in a supposedly neutral society, a kind of a predominant worldview will come to dominate. And you could say that predominant worldview is a kind of market way of seeing the world. It's one in which, because there are no objective values, everything is always being evaluated in terms of a kind of market calculation, which will ultimately devolve into, well, what will your society truly be devoted to? Mm-hmm. It won't be some objective idea of the good, but it will have certain things it will be devoted to. It will be utility. It will be materialism, right? Comfort,
right?
And wealth maximization, which is what allows you to be free,
right?
Is wealth maximization.
Because every society does, at least implicitly, have a summum bonum. So Paul Tillich, used to say that all you need to know about someone you can find out by asking the question, what do you worship? Because everyone's got some highest ultimate concern, as he'd put it. Well, every society has got an ultimate concern. So you might say, oh, no, I'm bracketing all the questions of the good, but there really is a sense of the ultimate good, and you're displaying it there in a way, like so safety or for materialism or wealth become the ultimate goods of the society. So willy-nilly, it's there. It's not really bracketed. There is a kind of war between, competing visions of the good.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so of course, then not only, of course, now does this new understanding of freedom and what it values, what it regards as the highest good, not only does that come to predominate, but this worldview now becomes actively hostile to what we might think of as the kind of classical understanding and those who maintain the view of the classical understanding of liberty. And here's where I think, John Courtney Murray, writing in the post-World War II era,
50s,
was more sanguine about sort of the American situation, and I think maybe is warranted today, because it still seemed like you had a kind of civil society that still could bear, and bring to bear commitments to the good that leavened this more utilitarian, functionalist, materialist world. But I think when you look at, again, the logic of this Hobbesian, Lockean liberalism, what it really will begin to do is both erode those values or those understandings of the good and then turn hostile to them.
Yeah.
Right. Actively hostile toward them. Because what are they? They are now a kind of effort to impose some notion of the good, even if it's on their own pluralist population, it's still a form of oppression.